Welcome to the IFS Metrix 5.6 Workflows presentation. My name is Don Hasenroll, and I'm a Senior Software Architect for IFS Metrix. Today we're going to give you an overview of workflows. We're going to talk about the activities that you use to build a workflow. We're going to go through the Workflow Designer, and I'll give you a demo of that, and then we'll talk about how the methods that you can use to execute a workflow once you've created it. And we'll go through a demo of executing a workflow, and then I will let you know where you can find the material that I've used here in the demo. Workflows are a tool for automating business processes. The workflow functionality provides a framework that is powerful and flexible, which enables savvy business users, consultants, and IT to create, test, edit, and share workflows that support their unique business requirements. Most of this is done through customization, configuration, and we also have some customization options that you can do also, and some code extensions. Workflows are also designed to be easy to use and intuitive for the end users. So when the workflow is executed, the user is guided through a step-by-step flow where the pages are selectively displayed and questions are dynamically shown based upon the rules and the answers chosen. So I'm going to give you some of the terminology that we're going to be using. So a workflow is a sequence of connected steps that execute together to complete a specific process. A workflow is a set of activities that are organized hierarchically in a tree structure. The activity is the fundamental building block of workflows. An activity represents an action in workflow, such as a question to ask, an XML message to execute, or an indicator that the workflow is complete. When I talk about a workflow instance, I'm talking about a specific run execution of the workflow. And when you see WF, that's the abbreviation that we use for workflows. And now I'm going to talk about the workflow activities that you can use. There are 4 basic types of activities that we're going to be using. There's activities that we collect, where we collect data from the user. And there's also activities that perform an action when they get executed, and other activities that control the flow of the workflow. And then we have some other activities that we use. There are containers. They hold other workflows and they kind of organize it and group it together. The first data collection activity is a question activity, and a question displays a control to collect a single data value. Values can then be used in XML messages, passed into screens, or used in conditions. Values can be flagged as being required or optional. Values collected are in memory until sent to the server through another activity, most often an XML activity. The control that's used for the question can be linked to the metadata of a column, which is handy for validations, or you can throw one together on the fly as a standalone question. The question can display a question that should be read out loud if you're doing this from a call center. For example, if someone calls in and you're reading off a script. And then there's also a separate area that could be for a comment where for whoever's actually executing might give them a hint on what to do. The message IDs that are used in questions allow for multi-language support. And then we also add, the question activity will also support regular expressions and styles. Our second data collection activity is the screen activity. And the screen activity displays a screen built through the Studio's user interface builder. If the screen that you're showing is a lookup, that will show as a pop-up. Other screens will be embedded directly inside the workflow control. The values that are collected, and we can pass values into the screen that we can use as search, selection, and parent criteria. Values can also be passed out of the screen to be used by the rest of the workflow. Any of the existing screens that we have could be used inside a workflow, but generally, especially if you're going to be showing your workflow as a pop-up, you might want to fine-tune your whatever screens you're showing be more succinct into what that process needs. Changes made to the screen are sent to the server as normal for a screen. So that's kind of an important point, is when you show a screen, the data is being directly selected from the server, and any data that changes you make and data you save goes right to the server immediately. Okay, our first action activities I'm going to talk about are the XML and the invoke activities. The XML sends an XML message to the server, and you can set up substitution variables that you can pass values that were collected in the workflow into that XML message. And then when we get the XML response back, we can parse that and take values from that response and put them into the workflow. As part of the XML activity, you can also display a notification after the response. And actually, if you wanted to just throw a notification up without sending an XML message, you can do that too using the XML activity. Our second action activity is the invoke method. And this is if you want to create a client assembly method to do something more complicated. So you pretty much can do anything you can think of through that. And the UI interface that use for custom client assemblies has methods to let you work with the workflow. So it can get values from the workflow, set values in the workflow, and then once you've done whatever you want to do in that, you can then continue the workflow, or you could cancel it if for whatever reason your custom method did something to say, okay, they're done, they don't want to be doing anything else with this. Our third action activity is the embedded workflow. And this allows you to execute a workflow from inside another workflow. So this allows for sub-workflows to be created and reused from other workflows. For example, you might have an address workflow that you use if they're executing the contact workflow or if they're executing the request creation workflow. Values can be passed into and out of the embedded workflow. And when you're actually executing the embedded workflow, it's seamlessly integrated. You really can't tell the difference between an execution that you started one workflow from another. And they can be nested. The example I'm going to show you, for example, we have a workflow that adds an RMA, and inside that we may add a contact, and in that contact workflow we may call the address adding workflow. Our fourth and last action activity is the assign activity. And this is used to set a value in the workflow. And that's generally only useful if you are executing some kind of conditional activity, and perhaps they set a particular question to an answer means that we should also set these 3 or 4 other variables. But if they picked a different value, we'd want to set those 3 or 4 other things to some other set of values. Flow activities kind of control the flow of what you're going to be doing in the workflow. The first two here is cancel and finish points, and a cancel point indicates that after that activity is executed, the default cancel button behavior should be overwritten. The default behavior is that it simply closes the workflow. When the user presses cancel after the cancellation point has been reached, we can say that we want them to enter a reason for the cancellation, and if we have that turned on, they're required to enter a reason. When the cancellation is performed, a workflow instance record that keeps track of the information that was collected so far is saved with a canceled status. So you can see a history of the workflow was executed, but it was canceled. And when the cancel point is executed, then we could optionally choose to close the workflow altogether, or we could leave the workflow open and reinitialize it for a new instance. Similar to the cancel point, we have a finish point, and that indicates that after the finish point activity is executed, the user can finish the workflow at any time. So the thought there is that they may have a series of steps that are required, but once we get to a certain point, we've collected all the minimum data that we need, and they could finish it, and it wouldn't affect the basic process. When the finish point activity is executed, the preserve button, which is used to stop a workflow instance to pick up later, is changed to finished. And then when the finish is executed, a workflow instance record is created with a completed status and keeps track of all the workflow data that was collected at that point. And like the cancellation point, you can optionally choose to close the workflow, or you can reinitialize it with a new instance. Continuing on with the flow activities, we have a terminate activity, and we have the if activity. The terminate activity indicates that the existing workflow instance should be immediately terminated. Perhaps, just for whatever reason, something they've entered means that we're done here, we can't continue. They are missing a required piece of information, something like that. If a finish point activity was previously executed, so the preserve button is changed to a finished, when the workflow is terminated, it goes through just as if they'd pressed the finish button. It creates the instance record with a completed status. Otherwise, if there was no finish point activity executed, it executes as if the cancel point activity was executed if that was there. So if the user presses the cancel button, it'll do whatever happens there. If you terminate the activity and you haven't hit a finish point or a cancel point, it just closes it out and that data just goes away. And as the other two activities, you can choose to optionally close the workflow or leave it open and reinitialize it for a new instance. Our last flow activity is the if activity. And this is used to decide to go down one of two possible paths based on a variable value. And you can have additional activities, ultimately additional activities are contained inside the if activity. So there's a then portion. So if the particular value equals A, then do this, else do that. So inside the then and the else, then there are other activities that are going to continue on with the workflow. Now I'm going to talk about the container activities, and we have step wizard and wizard containers. And the step activity contains a single activity. This kind of wrappers it, and it also contains an optional condition that you can use to skip over that step if you so choose. So normally you have to have every activity has to be contained within inside a step activity with a couple exceptions. For example, the then and the else portion in an if statement don't have to have another step there. The wizard container contains one or more steps. So this is most often used inside a conditional step when you want to do multiple steps based upon that condition. So for example, if you wanted your if condition to then collect two more question information, send an XML message, and display notification, you would want to put a wizard container in there and then start putting in additional steps to do those other activities. The outermost container for the entire workflow is the wizard container, and generally that's not used other than that outermost container. And when you start a new workflow, it's there for you always, so you'll probably never have to use the wizard container. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about designing workflows, and the screen that we use for designing workflows is the Workflow Designer, and that's located off of the Studio menu. And this screen has a number of different components. On the upper left corner, we have the Workflow Toolbox. And if you can see in the list, you'll see our various activities that we've gone through are contained in that toolbox. Underneath that is a list of existing workflows that you can click back on for editing. And in the middle of the Workflow Designer, we have the workspace, which is where you drag your activities into the workflow to control the flow. On the upper right corner, we have the workflow information, and that contains information about the workflow, such as the ID, whether it's active, whether it should be shown in a pop-up, that type of stuff, as well as user-defined, coding things, type, class, category, those type of things. Below that, we have the property editor, which is where you edit the properties for the individual activities. And the properties that are shown there change based upon the type of activity that you're looking at. On a particular screenshot I'm showing you there, those are the properties for a question activity. And at the bottom of the screen, we have the button bar, and that contains new, save, run, stuff like that. So now I'm going to go over to the Workflow Designer demo and show you a little bit that in practice. So here we have the Workflow Designer, and as I said, that we get to that by going to the Studio menu and Workflow Designer. I just already had it started here. When you first come into the screen, and if you press the New button, you're going to have a initialized workflow that contains the basic containers for you to start. And so we have the outer container, the wizard, and then we have a place for the first step. And these red icons allow us to drag additional steps into the workflow. And then depending upon which one you pick, depends on where it goes in the workflow. So in this particular example, I've got a workflow that contains 3 steps so far. And for the first one here, I might want to have a question. And then perhaps I'll add another question. And then after I've collected those 2 pieces of information, maybe I'll send an XML message to the server. So I'm going to then click on our workflow that we're going to be using in the demo just to show you a little bit more of the details without having to set everything else up here. Okay, so this workflow is for creating an RMA. So we have several questions, and first we ask the first name. So I'm clicking on here, and this shows you the properties for the first question control. And you can see here that I've used message IDs for the comment and the question, so those can be shown in multi-languages. I have it linked to the first name column for the contact table, and I'm going to be showing this as a text box. It's a required control, and I'm going to be recording this information with the step ID called first name, and that's important because that's how I'm going to use those values later in XML messages and stuff like that. After that, the first name, we've got the last name, then this is a XML activity where we're going to basically, this one doesn't actually show an XML message. It just sends a notification message saying, hey, use the information, the first name and the last name to pick the contact if it already exists. So based upon that, after that notification, we then show an embedded screen, and this is the contact lookup. So this one will actually show as a pop-up, and I'm going to pass in is search criteria. I'm going to pass in that first name and last name values. Okay, and then when we come out of that, I'm going to get if they select a contact record, I'm going to take the contact sequence, and I'm going to take the place ID, and I'm going to load those into the workflow. So these are the item names here, that are how they're referenced on the screen, and the variable is how it actually gets popped into the workflow. Okay, so this step here has a condition on it, and this is actually going to look at I'm going to click on the VB editor here, and this will kind of show you that we're going to look at that contact sequence value and see if it's not null. Then we would skip this, because ultimately what we have inside here is the contact add. So if they didn't pick a contact from the pop-up, then what we would do is we would go into the embedded contact add workflow, and we can see into that workflow, we pass the first name and last name variables from our existing workflow, and when we come out, we get the address ID and the new contact sequence that it created for that contact. Next, we move on to see whether we need to add a place for this contact. So if they added a new contact, we're going to want to add a new place, and we're going to skip over it if we already have a place. And this would open up the embedded place add workflow. Once we get to this point, they've pretty much gone through enough information that if they cancel it, we want to know why. So we have the cancellation point here. So, and we're requiring that they enter a reason, and then this one is going to close the workflow instance if they cancel it. So after we've collected the contact and the place information, we're going to ask them why they called, and then we're going to let the user that's executing the workflow determine whether this should be an RMA or a field service request. And then based upon what they enter here, we're either going to go to, we're going to show a screen that will, oh, actually, excuse me here. If they're doing an RMA, we're going to be creating the RMA XML message to send in. Then they're going to be going to a new custom screen to enter their line information. And so here, this is the first time we've had a screen here, an embedded screen. And this is going to be a screen that I created just for line entry. So it's real thinned down compared to what we normally have an RMA entry. And we're going to pass in the RMA ID, and then we also, with screen activities, we have the option of expanding the workspace, so there won't be a search and result area for this screen. When they get to the point where they've done all the line entries, we've hit a finish point, so they can now press finish. They've done all the data that they need to complete their RMA, but we're also going to show a summary screen at the end. So this notification message is going to show, hey, make sure the user knows their RMA ID and when they need to ship everything in, that kind of information. And then we have the RMA summary screen that we show. And this is what would happen if they were creating an RMA. If we're not creating an RMA, and then we're going to go through more of a traditional field service request insert. Where we create the request, we hit the finish point, and then we show them an RMA summary where they can add a normal thing, whatever else they want to add, notes or part requests or that kind of information to the request. And after all this is done, if they run through the entire workflow and they get to this point, it's over, and we're terminating the workflow. Okay, let me get back to my presentation here. So a few tips for the designer. As we discussed, you need to have your activities wrappered inside the step activities. So what I find is it's easy to grab a whole bunch of step activities all at once, pop them all in the workflow, and you can always delete the other ones later if you don't need them. The conditions for skipping steps and executing if activities are written in VB script. And it can be a little tricky not knowing exactly what how you need to get the values in and out of the workflow context. So we have a workflow editor tool. So when you see one that says enter VB script here, if you click in there, then you click in the VB editor tool, it'll take you to a little pop-up, and that will help you create a basic VB script for user conditions. But if you know VB script quite well, you can do a lot more things in there too, but this is just for a basic one. When you're entering question controls, you almost always want to have a step ID property. And that's because anything that's if you don't have a step ID, you can't use it in an XML message. And you can't use it. You can't pass it in and out of screens and stuff like that, or to use as other substitution variables. Question controls are grouped together as long as the page information for that those question controls doesn't change. So if you've got a series of 5 questions and you want to have a page title for the first one, and as long as you don't set a page title for any of those other questions, it'll keep appending them to the same question control. So you'll see them kind of come in one at a time as they're being processed, but then you can look back and see the old ones. When you're grabbing XML messages to use in XML activities, it's often easiest to go to a screen that you know that works with that object. For example, the RMA add, I want to know how to format a request insert statement, and then grab that out of the XML log, and then you can use that, manipulate that to what you want to use, and then post that in your XML activities. When you are creating XML messages, you can substitute in values from your workflow by using the @ syntax that we're talking about here. You have @ and then you have the step ID. So in this case, an example, @ request ID. And I realized I didn't show that to you. So let me go ahead and I would like to show that to you in an XML message before I continue. So here in an XML message, you can see that we put in the request ID that we've collected, the place ID, the custom problem description. Those are all substituted from the workflows. And here we're inserting the request record, and we're also doing the request contact record. And in there, we're going to be passing in the contact sequence. Yeah, it's easy to make a copy of the workflow that you're working on by selecting it from the existing workflows, going to the workflow ID and changing it, pressing the save button will make an instant copy. And if you're going to be doing some drastic changes and you already have a workflow that it works and you're happy with it, you might want to do a copy before you do really drastic changes to make sure you don't mess it up too bad, or you have something to go back to the way it used to work. If you create a workflow in a test or development environment and you want to eventually load that into the production environment, you can do that through the standard export and import functions. And the table that you want that contains the workflow definition is the WF script table. So now I'm going to talk about how you can execute a workflow now that you've created one. And we have 4 methods currently that you can execute the workflow. On the Files menu, there's a My Workflow screen, which will show you all of the active and visible workflows. And you can add a workflow button to a screen, which will execute a workflow. You can execute a workflow through a menu option, or you can execute a workflow from a business rule. And workflows that are accessed through screens can be disabled via roles. From the My Workflows screen is located under the File menu, and that displays workflows that are both active and visible. And from there, you can see anything that was set up for, like the codes that were defined. You can see in that screen for the workflow, and also if there was notes or something like that, you can see that information there. There are 2 buttons on there: Run, which starts a new instance of workflow, and the Restart, which will let you restart a preserved workflow, a workflow that was started but not finished. You can also add a workflow button to a screen via the Studio User Interface Builder. You do that by going to the header and click on the green plus icon in the button bar, and then picking Workflow button. And once you've added the button, then you need to link workflows that can be executed from that button. And you do that by going to the 3rd pencil icon in the header area, and the float over that will say Edit Workflow Group. And then from that button, from that little screen, you can add a number of workflows that can be executed by that button, and then whatever labels that you want to use for when it shows up. And when the button actually gets rendered on a screen and executed, when you click on it, you will see a drop down that will show you whatever workflows are enabled on that screen and they have access to based upon their role, as well as a restart option for restarting preserved instances. You can add a workflow directly on the menu. And you would do that by going to the Studio's custom functions and adding a function ID for it first, which would be equal to your workflow ID, and then have a type of workflow as shown here on the screenshot. And then you go and add that function to whatever menu that you want to add it on to by going to the Studio's custom menus screen. And an important thing to know when you're adding a menu, adding a workflow to a menu, the menu will only start new instances. There's no mechanism of restarting a preserved instance from the menu. If you wanted to restart a preserved instance, you'd have to go to My Workflows, pick the workflow, hit the restart button. You can also execute workflows from a business rule. So you would do this by creating a custom process of an import XML type. And the rules will have an XML message value, which should contain a start workflow message as shown in the screenshot here. This is an example here. The message must contain a workflow ID tag and may contain parameter tags that will be passed into the workflow as it starts. So the particular screenshot here was going to start a workflow called the contact screen, which would pass in a contact sequence value, from the object that was the business rule was executing on. And if you can include user input tags like you do for any import XML message. And if you do that, it will first go to a pop-up to collect those pieces of information and then start the workflow. If your start workflow message does not contain any user input tags, it will go right to the workflow without having the initial pop-up step. Now that we've gone through creating the workflow and how we can execute it, I'm going to show you an example of how we're going to execute the workflow. And what we did here is we added a workflow button to the RMA screen. So I'm going to click on that, and you can see that I can have the RMA add as one of my options or the restart. I'm going to start a new one here. This workflow is set up to come up in a pop-up, and I'm going to put in my first name here. And hello, thank you for calling. What is your first name? The message, the question here is what was in the question text message ID, and then the text off here to the right is the comment. Also, you can see that up in the top area here, this is the page information that was set up for the first question. So I put in there that we're collecting name information. We have a timer that records how long the workflow has been executed. We have our standard buttons of next, cancel, and preserve. And then we have a language selection that will let me change the language on the fly. Okay, when we tab out of the question we were just on, it's going to move on to the next one. So it's going to ask me for my last name here. And I keep messing up the caps lock. Okay. Okay, so we see down here that I've said we want to, pick up the user contact information, and you can see that it used my first and last name to limit the criteria here. I could change that if I wanted to, or I could, in this case, I'm just going to cancel and say, no, that's not me, because I want to show you the embedded workflow also. And had I picked one there, it wouldn't have taken me to the address information because it wouldn't have needed to. So I'm just going to come through here, put in something kind of like my address. Okay. This zip code field actually uses the regular expression to validate that it's a 5-digit zip code. Or it would also take the one with the extension too. Okay, we got a pop-up that the address information has been saved. I'm going to enter something kind of like a phone number here. This one uses a regular expression to add the dashes in there. Okay, so now we've added your contact information. They want to know where I work. And I'm just going to make something up here. And I'm going to say that I need some. Okay. Okay. The reason why the RMA required is underlined here, and the comment is in italics is just to show you that we can use styles there. So those are just styles that were applied to that question. And I'm going to say, yeah, I should create an RMA here based on what they've told me. Okay, so now I'm going to enter my line information. So here we can see that this is the place ID that it created for me, the name I entered for the place, my address information that I entered. This is the person I'm logged in as, so this is the user taking the call, and this was the RMA ID it created, as well as the description, and I could add additional comments here if I want. It has my contact information that I've added. I could enter a note if I wanted to enter some additional information, which is just fully functional screen stuff here. Then I'm going to enter a line. And it'll do validations because it's a fully functional embedded screen. And I'm going to move on to the next statement here. And we can see that my buttons changed to finished because I hit a finished point. And all the information that I entered with a comment telling the user to tell the caller that this is their RMA ID, this is where they should ship it to, and this is when it's due. Oh, and while I'm here, why don't I go ahead and change the language here. And I'll see some of these things have other languages, messages, some of them don't. That's just because we haven't made French labels for all these. But you can see, that the name changed, the address, operator, the very long comment for what an RMA ID is, and stuff like that. And then I could just go ahead and change that back to English and load that through and press finish. And let's just do a quick one here to show you what happens if I preserve one. And let's go ahead, and I'm going to preserve one here. It's going to give you an ID. And then if I come in here, hit the restart, it's going to come with a pop-up. And I restart that one right where I left off. Okay. And if you want to go ahead and take a look at the workflow that I used in the demo here, you can find those in the master demo or master SAS environments, or in those databases if you load one of those databases. So the workflows all start with workflow demo. We have workflow demo RMA, contact, address, and place. And the embedded screens that I use, I showed you two of those screens. I showed you the request line and the RMA summary. The request summary, if I would have said no at that one yes, no box, I would have gone there instead of the RMA ones. And the regular expressions that we used, I showed you the phone and the zip post. The email one, there was also an email one there, making sure that your email address had an ad in it. And the messages that are used for the workflow all start with workflow demo. There's quite a few of those there. Well, that's it. Thank you for listening.